Welcome to the Global Author Podcast. I'm Connor Whiteley, science fiction, fantasy, and a global author, bringing you publishing, writing, book marketing, and global author ideas for your book to help you sell more books and write better books. For more information and your free global author training, please go to theglobalauthor.com. And here's the show. Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 121 of the Psychology World Podcast with me, Con Whiteley. And today's episode is on myths about happiness. So I know this doesn't sound like traditional psychology, and to be honest, it isn't, but this still falls under the remit of social psychology, and if we push it out a little bit further, then it does fall under the remit of a clinical psychology, because if we're unhappy, then this can lead to decreases in mental health, and then it has the potential to create a lot of negative outcomes for us. So this is a really great episode, and I'm really enjoyed writing it up and now recording it. So that's coming up on the content part of today's episode. But moving on to the psychology news section, we've reading from the British Psychological Society Researcher Digest. And it is Saturday the 20th of November 2021 as I record to this. So the first one is: we enjoy deep conversations with strangers much more than we expected to. Sometimes the most meaningful conversations come out at surprising times, with someone that you meet on a train and never see again, or with a friend of a friend that you've only just met. Conversely, conversations with our close friends and family can often be difficult, and we sometimes fail to share our deepest thoughts and feelings with those we love the most. A new paper published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology finds that we seriously benefit from these deep conversations with strangers, but despite this, we sometimes remain reluctant to engage in them, overestimating their awkwardness and underplaying their advantages when we enjoy them more. And this I think is just such an interesting study, and this really does point out how amazing psychology is, and social psychology in particular, because I cannot imagine myself actively wanting to engage in a conversation with a stranger because, again though, as they said about the awkwardness, because what if the person thinks I'm a stranger? What if they think I'm a weirdo? Which I guess we all are in our own way. What if they refuse to talk? And all of those little concerns. And really though, I think it would just be so awkward though. But I guess this just shows that we really do need to focus, and we do need to remember that there are advantages. So this is really, really interesting, and I don't know if I would personally go out of my way to talk to a stranger, but it's still very interesting reading. Audio techniques makes people feel that their doppelganger is in the room with them. This, I think, sounded really creepy when I read the title. Hallucinatory experiences are pretty common, despite a widespread belief to the contrary. Researchers estimate that around 40% of the population regularly experiences hallucinations to some degree, whether that can be feeling your phone vibrate only at time to no notifications, or a full-on out-of-body experience. Though hallucinations are common, some are harder to study than others. One of the trickiest has been autoscopic hallucinations, during which people experience a doppelganger of all or part of their bodies in the space around them. Though this hallucination has been reported to clinicians, its rarity has been made it difficult to study in an experimental setting, so researchers have instead attempted to induce the phenomenon in the lab. Now, a new paper reports a way to experimentally induce it in people with no history of hallucinations using only auditory cues. Wow, that is impressive. Scary, but impressive. So there are actually two main things though. So again, there were, you know that I've said this quite a few times, is that in psychology, we always need to be focusing on what the facts are and not our common opinions and our own beliefs, because of course, these hallucinations, they tend to happen a lot more common than we believe, so that's the fact, but our common belief, it says that they're very rare. Yes, and not only the mentally ill, can't believe people still use that term, tend to get hallucinations, so very interesting. But the second one is that inducing hallucinations using only auditory cues. That sounds really scary, but also really interesting, and I would love for my university to do some research about that. But I don't know, I just think that's so interesting. And again though, I know that I tend to talk about methodology quite a bit, and I don't know why, considering I'm never usually that interested in methodology, but I think this just shows that it's always good to try and think out the box, just in case you come across that, or you can create a really interesting, a really sort of like revolutionary cue, because it'd be interesting to see what else can you induce using auditory cues, and possibly quite a scary one. Okay, so what we will do one more. Ghosting is more acceptable to people with the dark triad traits. Even in the most shallow data would have to concede that our personalities plays a huge role in our romantic lives. How we start relationships, how we behave when we're in them, and how they end are all intimately related to our personality traits, good and bad. A study in actor psychology, completely butchered that, looks closely at one way a relationship can fail, through ghosting. For those lucky enough to be unfamiliar with the term, ghosting refers to the act of ending a relationship by simply ceasing to respond with the other person, removing them from social media, unmatching them on a dating app, and failing to ever text back. And the team finds that this strategy is considered more acceptable by those high in the dark triad traits of psychopathy, Machiavellianism, which I love that word still, and narcissism. So I really do enjoy learning about personality, like personality psychology, because it's so interesting, and I think this only adds that to it, because I find it amazing how our personality traits can actually influence our behaviour in so many really interesting ways. But I think that the only thing I can say from this psychology news section is just don't ghost. I think it's just wrong, quite disrespectful. Yeah, and I just don't know why people do it. At least break up, consciously and actually in a person. So interesting to say the least. So I hope you've enjoyed the psychology news section. So let's move on to the personal update. So we're moving on to the personal update. So because this week's been a bit slow and there's actually been not a lot of interesting stuff going on, I'm actually sort of going to skip the personal updates because I've been doing lots of other things. I've still been continuing on with my placement, but there's nothing interesting enough to report to you wonderful listeners. So I'm actually just going to skip the personal update. So as always, I always love to hear your thoughts and feelings on today's episode. So you can always email me, connorwhiteley@connorwhiteley.net. You can always leave a comment on the show notes at connorwhiteley.net/podcast, and you can always tweet me on Twitter at sci-fi whiteley. I always love to hear from you because it really helps make the podcast feel more like a conversation. And today's episode has been sponsored by Social Psychology, a guide to social and cultural psychology 3rd edition. So this is an absolute brilliant sponsor for today's episode, because the book does end up looking at happiness, and also it actually tackles tons of myths about happiness. So this really does build upon today's episode really well. But this book also goes into great depth about the other areas of social psychology. For example, a group influence, persuasion, and just a wider group of psychology. So it's really good. It goes into so much great depth, but it's really engaging. And this is not a boring textbook whatsoever. You're actually going to enjoy reading this book. So I cannot recommend it enough. And that is Social Psychology, a guide to social and cultural psychology, 3rd edition, available from all major ebook retailers, and you can order the large print paperback and the hardback versions from Amazon, your local bookstore, and local library if you request it. But if you didn't want to buy a book, I bet you still wanted to give the podcast a bit of one-time support, you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Connor Whiteley. And both of these options are absolutely brilliant ways to help keep the podcast going and help me producing the show, because it does take quite a bit of the time, and the editing, the distribution, and my time do cost money. So this just helps the podcast keep it going for a little longer. So that's enough of the very quick personal update. So let's move into the content part of today's episode. So we're moving on to the content part of today's episode. So we're going to be talking about 5 myths about happiness. And the reason why I wanted to talk about this is because there are a lot of myths about happiness that exist in the world, and some of these can be damaging. And these myths can damage our mental health, but our social connections as well. So in this episode, we're going to be looking at happiness and the myths around it. So I hope that you learn something. But I sort of preluded to this in a psychology news section though. But the reason why I wanted to talk about this is that, yes, I know this podcast is mainly for psychology students and psychology professionals. But the reason why I wanted to talk about it though was that being a student and a professional can be stressful. So our happiness can be on a roller coaster ride, and when this happens, I don't want you to fall for any of these myths that can actually end up making you feel worse than you might already feel. So let's dive into some of these myths. If I have lots of money, I'll never be sad. And this one I've never understood though, because we've all heard stories of like millionaires being sad and feeling alone, but happiness isn't made from tangible things, and once the basic needs of a person are actually taken care of, the luxuries that money can buy don't make much of a difference. And this was actually reinforced from a study from Princeton University in 2010, which I found after $75,000, a person's happiness isn't affected by money. So the overall lesson of this myth is that just don't be obsessed with the money, and this myth about happiness. When I find true love, I'll be happy. So whatever your beliefs about love, this is possibly the most common myth that humankind believes, because love is great and it can make you feel wonderful, equal in happiness, but it can hurt too. It can be extremely painful. So just because you will find love doesn't mean that happiness is a certainty. Anyone who's had a breakup, I can sympathise with at that point. If I have a fulfilled life, I can never be unhappy. Now, this myth is actually a bit more complicated, because whilst we have a fulfilled life that can actually start off mental health difficulties and other negative outcomes for the person, it's when we get into the nitty gritty of this myth that problems start to arise. Mainly because everything has a life cycle, and enjoyment is no different. So it's normal for what makes your life fulfilled to not bring you as much joy as it used to. And that's why doing new and interesting things is important in life, and keeping things varied. Again, that's another relationship point, because I've heard lots of relationships that died because nothing new and exciting was happening there. For example, drawing on a personal example, where there's been lots of activities over the years that I've started to find boring after a while, and other activities in those painful memories, which is why now I make sure that I do different things from time to time. For example, in my personal life, I cook new things, I go to different places with friends and family, and to make sure that I learn about newer things, which is one of the reasons why I love psychology, though, because there's always new areas of psychology to learn, and you can always learn new things by reading different psychologists and so on. So overall, yes, definitely try and have a fulfilled life to be happy and to keep your mental health, but be prepared to find new things to love if the old activities aren't as fun as they used to. Dealing with two myths in one. So there are two myths that I want to combine, and these myths are about I have to be more than okay to be happy, and if you're not happy, I'm sad. These are two interesting myths, because on the surface we always think of them as being true, but they aren't. At least not at first, because you might not be happy when you're just okay, but you might just be content with life, and that's fine. And there's nothing wrong with just being okay with your life and enjoying it, since when you're content, you aren't feeling sad, depressed, and your mental health is okay. So what's wrong with that? Problem with this myth is when people start to feel like they always need to be happy, and I understand why. Feeling happy is amazing, and we all want it. But when you're always seeking to be happy, this can be taxing and probably leading you to feel sad and like a failure for not being happy. So overall, happy is a very strange concept that you won't always feel, but being content is enough. Think of it as a happy middle ground between sadness that affects your mental health and happiness where you're amazing. Therefore, I wanted to end this episode by saying that being sad that you aren't happy won't make you feel any better. However, if you enjoy your life, be content, and make the lives of other people better, as well as being kind, then that will definitely help you feel better, and it will protect your mental health in the long term. So I really hope that you enjoyed today's episode, and that I hope you learned something. If you know someone who would enjoy today's episode, then please share it with them. I'm always really grateful when you wonderful people help spread the word about the podcast. And if you want to learn more about social psychology and all of these different areas, then please check out Social Psychology, a guide to social and cultural psychology, 3rd edition, available in all the usual places. So have a great day, everyone, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to see the show notes, then please go to connorwhiteley.net. And if you want a free 8-book psychology box set, then please go to connorwhiteley.net. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time.